In April 1945, as Soviet artillery closed in on Berlin, the Third Reich was collapsing in plain view of the world. Entire districts of the German capital lay in ruins, buildings burned without response, civilians sheltered in basements as shells fell day and night. The army that had once swept across Europe had been driven back to its own streets. Soviet forces were advancing block by block. The war in Europe was nearing its conclusion. Beneath the rubble, Adolf Hitler waited. He had retreated to the Führer bunker, a reinforced concrete shelter beneath the Reich Chancellery. It had been designed as a command center, a place to direct campaigns across continents. Now it functioned as the final refuge of a shrinking regime. The corridors were narrow, the air was heavy, electric lights hummed overhead, maps still lined the walls, maps that once tracked offensives into Poland, France, North Africa, and the Soviet Union. By April 1945, those maps no longer reflected reality. Reports arriving at the bunker grew increasingly detached from conditions above ground. Units that had been destroyed were ordered to counterattack. Commanders were instructed to hold positions that no longer existed. Whether through denial or determination, Hitler continued issuing directives as if the machinery of war still obeyed him. Physically, he had changed. Witnesses described a pronounced tremor in his left hand. His posture had stooped. His movements were slower. His complexion pale. Yet flashes of anger remained. He blamed generals for betrayal. He accused the German people of failing him. Responsibility, even then, was displaced. Outside, the sound of artillery grew closer. On April 29, 1945, with Soviet troops only streets away, Hitler made a decision that surprised even those in the bunker. Shortly after midnight, he married Eva Braun, his companion of many years. The ceremony was brief and subdued. A small group gathered. Eva wore a simple dark dress. Afterward, champagne was poured. Those present later recalled the strangeness of it, a wedding taking place as a capital city collapsed overhead. In the early morning hours, Hitler dictated his political testament. He appointed successors. He continued to deny responsibility for the destruction unfolding across Europe. Even at the end, the narrative remained controlled. By the afternoon of April 30th, the situation was undeniable. Soviet forces were within a few hundred yards of the Reich Chancellery. Hitler gathered his staff for a final farewell. One by one, he shook their hands. Some wept quietly. Others stood rigid, unsure how to behave in such a moment. There was no grand speech, no final public address, only brief words and formal gestures. Around 3:30 p.m., Hitler and Eva Braun withdrew into his private study. A short time later, a single gunshot echoed through the bunker corridor. For several seconds, no one moved. Those waiting outside understood what it likely meant, but entering without permission had never been allowed. Eventually, aides opened the door. Hitler sat slumped on a sofa. He had bitten into a cyanide capsule and shot himself in the head. Eva Braun lay beside him, having taken poison. She had been his wife for less than 40 hours. The instructions he had left were carried out immediately. The bodies were wrapped in blankets and carried up through the bunker exit into the devastated garden above. Soviet shells continued to fall nearby. Gasoline was poured over the remains. They were set alight. Flames rose into the gray Berlin sky as those present offered a final salute. The fire was meant to prevent his body from being captured and displayed. Even in death, control mattered. Within days, Germany would surrender unconditionally. Across Europe, concentration camps would be liberated, revealing crimes that shocked even seasoned soldiers. Hitler would never stand trial. There would be no public testimony from him, no courtroom reckoning. Only charred remains in a ruined garden. But history rarely closes in a single way. In the final weeks of the war, power was collapsing across Europe. And collapse did not look the same everywhere. Some leaders died in silence, others were dragged into the open. Some controlled their final moment, others lost that choice entirely. What happens when absolute power finally runs out? Does it end in secrecy or spectacle? As Berlin burned, another fascist leader was attempting to flee north, disguised among retreating forces. He would not find a bunker. He would not determine the manner of his death. His final hours would unfold before a watching crowd, and the world would see a very different ending. In Module 2, we turn to northern Italy and to Benito Mussolini's final journey. By April 1945, fascist Italy was no longer in control of its own future. Rome had been liberated months earlier. German forces were retreating north.
Across the country, symbols of Mussolini's regime were being removed from public buildings. For more than 20 years, Benito Mussolini had styled himself as Il Duce, decisive, theatrical, unchallenged. Now he was attempting to leave quietly. On April 27, 1945, Mussolini joined a German convoy moving toward the Swiss border. He wore a German military overcoat and helmet. His posture, once rigid and confident, was subdued. Clara Petacci traveled with him, unwilling to separate even as the situation deteriorated. The convoy moved slowly along the western shore of Lake Como. Near the village of Dongo, partisan fighters had established a checkpoint. They were searching vehicles for fleeing fascist officials. Trucks were stopped one at a time, documents examined, faces studied. Mussolini remained seated among German soldiers, saying nothing. A partisan stepped onto the truck's running board and looked inside. His eyes moved across the uniforms, then paused, not on insignia, but on a face partly shadowed beneath a helmet. He looked again. Another partisan was quietly summoned. A brief exchange followed in low voices. They leaned closer. There was a pause, not long, but enough to confirm what they suspected. It's him.
Mussolini was ordered out of the vehicle. He did not resist. Witnesses later described him as tired, his expression drained rather than defiant. He and Petacci were separated from the convoy and taken into custody. The news spread quickly among partisan ranks. Il Duce had been captured, not on a battlefield, but in retreat. He was held overnight in a nearby building. Accounts suggest he spoke little. There were no speeches, no attempts to rally sympathy. The following afternoon, April 28th, the order arrived. There would be no transfer, no delay. Mussolini was to be executed. He and Petacci were driven to the small village of Giuliano di Mensegra. The road was quiet. Spring light filtered through the trees. They were positioned near the gate of a villa along a narrow wall. Details differ slightly among witnesses, but the essential facts remain clear. Mussolini stood facing the wall. Petacci remained beside him. There was a brief hesitation as weapons were raised. Gunfire followed. It was over within seconds. He was 61 years old. For more than 2 decades, Mussolini had cultivated the image of strength, chin lifted, voice booming across balconies in Rome. In the end, there was no crowd to address, no uniformed supporters assembled below, only a roadside and a small group of armed men. But the quiet moment did not define the day. The bodies were loaded into a truck and transported to Milan. The destination carried deliberate symbolism, Piazzale Loreto. Months earlier, 15 anti-fascist partisans had been executed there under fascist authority. Their bodies had been left exposed as a warning. The location had not been forgotten. On the morning of April 29th, Mussolini's body, along with Petacci and several other executed officials, was placed in the square. Crowds gathered rapidly. Years of repression, propaganda, and war had left deep wounds. Now those emotions surfaced. Some shouted, some struck the bodies. Others simply stared in silence, as if confirming for themselves that the era had ended. Eventually, the corpses were hoisted upside down from the metal framework of a service station canopy. Photographs were taken. Within days, those images appeared in newspapers around the world. The contrast with Berlin was unmistakable, but no commentary was needed. The images spoke for themselves. In Germany, a dictator had ended his life underground. In Italy, another was displayed above a public square. 2 regimes collapsing within days of each other. 2 very different endings. As Europe's war drew to its close, power was dissolving in different ways across the continent. In some places, collapse was chaotic and visible. In others, it would unfold behind guarded walls. Far from the crowds of Milan, inside a secured residence outside Moscow, another ruler was entering his final days. There would be no partisans at the gate, no public square, only silence and a door no one dared to open. On the night of March 1st, 1953, Joseph Stalin hosted a dinner at his dacha outside Moscow. Such gatherings were familiar to his inner circle. Senior officials attended regularly, men who commanded armies and ministries, fully aware that proximity to Stalin meant both influence and danger. His approval could elevate, his suspicion could destroy. The evening stretched late. There was food, heavy drinking, guarded conversation. Laughter surfaced carefully. No one at the table forgot where they were. Around 4 in the morning, Stalin dismissed his guests and withdrew to his private quarters. Nothing appeared unusual. The following morning, however, something was. Stalin kept a routine. By late morning, he typically rang for staff. Guards stationed outside his rooms expected movement by midday. On March 2nd,
There was none. Late morning passed, then early afternoon. The guards noticed, so did the household staff, but no one entered. For decades, Stalin had ruled through purges, denunciations, and sudden arrests. Even senior officials had disappeared overnight. Recently, prominent doctors had been accused in what became known as the Doctors' Plot, deepening suspicion across the political elite. In that atmosphere, initiative carried risk. The door remained closed. By evening, unease outweighed protocol. A guard finally forced himself to act. Inside, Stalin lay on the floor beside his desk. He had suffered a massive stroke. His right side was paralyzed. His breathing was uneven. Papers lay scattered nearby. A clock ticked steadily in the room. He had likely fallen hours earlier, alone.
Doctors were summoned. Treatment began, but valuable time had already been lost. Stalin drifted in and out of consciousness over the next several days. He could not speak clearly. At moments, his eyes opened, unfocused, then closed again. Members of the Politburo gathered at his bedside, men who had lived under his authority for years. They watched quietly. Power was shifting, though no one said so aloud. On March 5, 1953, at 9:50 p.m., Joseph Stalin died. He was 74 years old. The announcement was delivered in solemn tones across Soviet radio. In Moscow, crowds assembled. Many wept openly. Long lines formed to view his body as it lay in state. Official tributes emphasized his leadership in war and industry, his role in shaping a superpower. Yet the final hours had unfolded differently. There had been no confrontation, no uprising, no public reckoning. Only a locked room, a fallen leader, and a long hesitation before anyone stepped inside. His body was embalmed and placed beside Vladimir Lenin in Red Square, a symbol of permanence. But permanence proved temporary. Within months, political currents shifted. Certain prisoners were released, policies were adjusted. The machinery of repression did not vanish, but it no longer moved with the same force. Stalin had governed through vigilance and fear. In the end, vigilance stalled. He did not face a firing squad. He did not choose his final moment. He lay on a wooden floor while the system he commanded waited outside. When the door finally opened, the era that defined him was already closing.
This is just one part of a larger series. More videos are coming soon. Make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss them. And tell us in the comments, what story should we cover next?